May 8, 1945, marked Victory in Europe Day. Across America, church bells rang and crowds filled the streets to celebrate. In prisoner of war camps from Texas to New York, German soldiers prepared to return to their defeated homeland. But in a small facility near Fort Deans, Massachusetts, something unusual took place. When American commanders informed a group of German women prisoners that they were free to go home, many of them made an unexpected request. They asked to stay. These women were not ordinary prisoners. They belonged to the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the last months of the war in Europe. They were young women who had served the Reich in different roles and were now faced with a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. What could make someone choose to remain in enemy hands rather than return to freedom in their own country? To understand this, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to November 1944, when the first group of German women prisoners arrived at the small camp. Unlike the larger camps for men, this one held fewer than 60 women, aged between 18 and 35. They had been captured in France and Belgium as German forces withdrew and had worked as radio operators, nurses, and office staff for the Wehrmacht. Captain Margaret Sullivan, one of the few female officers in charge of the facility, recalled her first meeting with them. The women stepped down from the transport truck showing a mix of defiance and uncertainty. They still wore parts of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some with insignia they had once worn proudly. Among them was 23-year-old Ingrid Brenner, a former communications specialist from Hamburg. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing she was helping defend her country. Now as a prisoner in America, she held tightly to a small leather diary that reminded her of her past life. The first few weeks were uneasy. The German women kept mostly to themselves, speaking quietly in German during meals. They followed camp routines without complaint, their expressions calm but distant. Captain Sullivan noticed how they still carried themselves like soldiers, standing straighter than many of her own men. But as autumn turned to winter, things began to change. It started with small acts of kindness from the American guards. Private James Morrison, a young man from Iowa, saw that one of the women, a thin blonde named Anna Weber, had a persistent cough. Without asking anyone's permission, he brought her an extra blanket and a cup of herbal tea made from a recipe his grandmother had taught him. Anna looked at him in surprise, confused by the unexpected kindness. She had been told that American soldiers were cruel, yet here was a man not much older than her brother showing care for her. She quietly said thank you, and for the first time since her capture, her stiff posture softened. Word of such gestures spread through the camp. Sergeant Robert Chen, whose parents had come from China, understood what it meant to be treated as an outsider. He began teaching basic English to any prisoner interested, using drawings and gestures when needed. Ingrid joined these lessons, remembering a bit of English from school, and found she was good at it. More importantly, she began to notice that the Americans were not what she had been told. Instead of hatred, she saw curiosity. Instead of cruelty, she saw simple humanity. Christmas 1944 brought the first major change in the camp's atmosphere. Captain Sullivan, knowing the women were homesick and sad, decided to arrange a small celebration. The women made simple decorations from whatever materials they could find. Then Ingrid approached the captain, speaking carefully in English, and asked if they could sing German Christmas songs and try to perform some American ones too. That evening, in the camp's main hall, 60 German women stood before their captors and began to sing. They started with O Tannenbaum, their voices blending beautifully. Then they tried Silent Night in English. Their pronunciation was imperfect, but their effort was heartfelt. Private Morrison later wrote to his family saying that as he listened to the German girls sing, he forgot for a moment that they were enemies. They seemed so young and far from home, reminding him of his sister and her friends back in Iowa. From that night onward, the atmosphere changed. The women began to talk more with the guards. They volunteered to help around the camp, not out of duty but because they wanted to. They helped in the kitchen, fixed uniforms, and those with medical training assisted the nurse. Ingrid became an interpreter, helping both sides communicate. Her English improved quickly, and she discovered that many of the American soldiers were as homesick and uncertain as the prisoners themselves. By February 1945, the camp had transformed. The women no longer kept to themselves during meals. Conversations in both languages filled the air. Sergeant Chen even organized informal language classes where the Americans learned German while the prisoners practiced English. But then came news from Germany that changed everything. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, reports emerged about concentration camps and horrific atrocities. Ingrid read American newspapers in shock. The photos were blurry, but the descriptions were clear enough. Her hands trembled as she read about Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, places she had never heard of. Anna found her crying and asked in disbelief if it could be true, if their country had really done those things. The other women gathered around, their faces showing the same horror. They were not hardened Nazis. They were young women who had believed they were serving their homeland. Now they were realizing they had unknowingly been part of something much darker. Captain Sullivan watched them quietly as they tried to come to terms with the truth. That night, Ingrid wrote in her diary, wondering what kind of Germany they would return to and what kind of Germany they had served. She felt lost, unsure of who she was or what she believed anymore. When victory finally came in spring 1945, the German women faced a difficult choice. Repatriation for male prisoners began across the country, but for these 60 women, their future remained uncertain. Reports from Germany described cities in ruins, families missing or dead, and a nation shattered. Many had no idea if their families were still alive. Meanwhile, life in the camp had become something entirely different from what it once was. It no longer felt like imprisonment but a small community. The American staff treated them not as enemies, but as displaced people caught in a tragedy. Ingrid had started writing to a local family, the Hendersons, who visited the camp through a church program. Mrs. Henderson, a school teacher, admired Ingrid's intelligence and how quickly she learned English. More than that, she was touched by the young woman's genuine sorrow over what her country had done. "You're not responsible for things you never knew about," Mrs. Henderson told her kindly during one of their talks. The question now was what they would do with the knowledge they had gained. Forgiveness from the Americans was one thing, but the women knew that returning to Germany would be entirely different. They would be viewed as failures, as soldiers who had been captured and influenced by the enemy. Even worse, they would be returning to a homeland that no longer represented the values they had once believed in. As the date of their repatriation approached, conversations among the German women became more emotional and filled with uncertainty. In the American prison camp, they had found something many of them had never experienced before: acceptance, purpose, and the hope of redemption. On the morning of May 15, 1945, the camp was filled with tension. Captain Sullivan had called all the prisoners together to announce official repatriation plans. 60 women gathered in the main hall, their faces showing the inner conflict that had been building for months. Holding documents from the War Department, Captain Sullivan addressed them calmly but kindly. She informed them that transportation would be arranged within 2 weeks and that they would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before returning home. Relief and worry appeared on their faces, but what happened next surprised everyone. Ingrid Brenner stood up slowly, trembling slightly, and asked for permission to speak. When the captain agreed, Ingrid looked around the room and said that some of them did not wish to return to Germany immediately. Her words stunned the hall. Anna Weber stood next, along with 12 others, and together they formed a small group among the rest. Anna spoke carefully, explaining that they knew their request was unusual, but that Germany no longer felt like home. The country they had served was not the one they believed in. Captain Sullivan was speechless. In all her service, she had never seen prisoners asked to remain in captivity instead of being freed. When she asked for an explanation, the women poured out their feelings. Ingrid explained that they had written to the International Red Cross to find news of their families. Out of the 14 who wished to stay, only 3 had received any reply. 2 had learned that their families were dead, killed in bombing raids, while the rest had no idea if anyone they loved had survived. But beyond this loss, they had also found something in the camp that they feared losing. Ingrid explained that in the camp they had learned what it meant to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. They had seen kindness instead of hatred, and had been given the chance to work and grow as people. Their request carried serious implications. Legally, they were still enemy prisoners of war and were required by the Geneva Convention to be repatriated. Yet their emotional plea touched something far beyond rules. Private Morrison, who had once shown Anna an act of kindness months earlier, spoke quietly to Captain Sullivan afterward. He told her that these women were no longer enemies, but people caught in something they never fully understood, and sending them back to nothing felt wrong. That evening, Captain Sullivan sent an urgent message to her superiors in Washington, explaining the situation. The reply would take several days, leaving everyone waiting anxiously. In the meantime, the women who wished to stay continued working with new determination, as if trying to prove they were worthy of being allowed to remain. During this waiting period, the atmosphere in the camp became almost unreal. The women threw themselves into their duties with renewed energy, not out of strategy, but because they had truly found purpose. Ingrid had become essential as a translator, not only for language but for understanding between cultures. She helped solve disputes, assisted with records, and even began teaching German to curious American staff members. Her diary entries from that time showed a woman discovering her own abilities and identity. Anna found her calling in the medical wing, assisting Dr. Robert Hayes. Her compassion and careful work made her invaluable. Dr. Hayes, who had once been unsure about having a German prisoner assist him, soon became her strongest supporter, saying that she had a true gift for healing. Others also found meaningful work. Maria Gotch improved the camp's record system, while Greta Hoffman proved skilled at mechanical repairs, fixing everything from kitchen tools to vehicles. Each woman had become important to the running of the facility. However, not everyone outside the camp supported them. News of their requests spread to nearby towns, sparking debate. Some newspapers criticized the idea of Nazi prisoners receiving special treatment, while Americans were still fighting in the Pacific. Others, especially those from local church groups who had met the women, wrote letters of support, saying the women had changed and shown real remorse. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who had befriended Ingrid, organized a group of local citizens to speak with the camp's leadership. She argued that these women were no longer who they once were, and that their transformation was proof of what redemption could look like if people were given a chance to change. The story soon reached newspapers in Boston and New York, where headlines described it in contrasting ways, some portraying the women as refusing freedom, others as having found new lives in America. The event became a symbol of deeper questions about justice, forgiveness, and human transformation. Letters also began arriving from other prison camps. German prisoners across the country had heard about the women at Fort Deans and wrote expressing similar doubts about returning home. Some even asked to be transferred there, hoping to delay their own repatriation. The story's impact had spread far beyond the camp. During this tense period, a visitor arrived, Father Hinrich Miller, a German-American priest from Worcester. He had asked for permission to speak with the women in their native language, and Captain Sullivan agreed, hoping he could offer guidance. His conversation with them lasted 3 hours and deeply affected everyone. Speaking in German, he helped the women express emotions they had struggled to communicate in English. But he didn't give them easy comfort. Instead, he challenged them to think about what their choice truly meant. He asked them what kindness they could show to those still suffering in Germany, and reminded them that perhaps home needs people most when it is broken and in need of rebuilding. Ingrid was deeply moved. She realized she had been focused on what returning to Germany might cost her, without thinking of what staying might cost others. Was their desire to remain in America based on principle or fear? The priest's visit sparked new debates among the women. Some began to reconsider and felt their duty was to go back and help rebuild their homeland. Others believed they could serve a greater purpose by staying in America and showing what reconciliation could look like. These discussions ended when Captain Sullivan finally received orders from Washington. The War Department's response was formal but unexpectedly flexible. Any prisoner who wished to return to Germany could do so immediately, but those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and considered for immigration status due to the extraordinary circumstances. The decision meant that the women would no longer be prisoners of war, but they would also lose the guaranteed housing and support they had at the camp. They now needed to find sponsors, jobs, and places to live in American communities that were willing to welcome former enemies. In many ways, this was a more difficult challenge than simply returning to Germany. The announcement caused division among the 14 women who had first asked to stay. 5 of them felt the uncertainty was too much and decided to be repatriated. They chose to go back to Germany, ready to face whatever awaited them with courage and hope. The other 9, led by Ingrid and Anna, decided to take the risk of beginning entirely new lives in America. Finding sponsors and work turned out to be easier than anyone expected. The Henderson family immediately agreed to sponsor Ingrid, offering her a place to live and help while she looked for work as a translator. Dr. Hayes arranged for Anna to continue her medical training at a local hospital and promised to guide her as she worked toward becoming a certified nurse. Other families in the area, moved by the women's sincerity and their story, also came forward to help. The same towns that had once been wary of having German prisoners nearby now welcomed the chance to be part of what they saw as a powerful story of forgiveness and second chances. Some of the women who had chosen to return to Germany made a surprising decision. They said they wanted to go home not as defeated prisoners, but as messengers of the reconciliation they had experienced in America. They hoped to bring back the lessons they had learned about forgiveness, cooperation, and how former enemies could become friends. The day of repatriation came on June 20th, 1945. The atmosphere at Fort Deans was unlike any other prisoner of war departure in American history. Instead of a cold, formal process of sending enemies home, it felt more like a farewell gathering among friends. The 46 women preparing to leave stood together, their posture less rigid than before. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time in the camp, and small gifts from guards and staff. Most importantly, they carried with them a new understanding of what America truly represented. Captain Sullivan spoke to them with words she later said were among the hardest she ever had to deliver. "You came here as our enemies," she told them, "but you leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest times." Ingrid, who had become the unofficial representative of the women staying behind, stood up to reply. Her English was now fluent and full of confidence. "Captain Sullivan," she said, "we came here thinking we knew what America was, but we learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies, but we discovered that our only real enemies were our own ignorance and hatred." The women who were staying in America watched tearfully as their friends boarded the vehicles taking them to the port in Boston, where ships would carry them back to Europe. The tears that day were not of sadness, but of hope. Both groups were stepping into unknown futures, but they were futures they had chosen for themselves. For those who stayed in America, the change from prisoners to immigrants was difficult yet fulfilling. Ingrid found work as a translator for the State Department, helping displaced people arriving from war-torn Europe. Her unique experience of seeing both sides of the conflict made her an essential link in helping others understand one another. Anna completed her nursing training and became head nurse at Worcester General Hospital. Her story spread through the community, and she was often invited to speak about forgiveness and personal transformation. She never married, dedicating her life to caring for others as a way of making peace with her past. The other women who stayed found their own ways to contribute and belong. Some married American soldiers they had met during their time in the camp, creating families that symbolized reconciliation between former enemies. Others pursued careers in teaching, social work, and business, always remembering the lessons of compassion and humanity they had learned. They stayed in contact with those who had returned to Germany, exchanging letters filled with stories of hardship, rebuilding, and hope. Years later, historians studying this unusual case of prisoners choosing to stay with their captors discovered that it had influenced American policy toward occupied Germany. The kindness shown to these women had proved that treating former enemies with dignity could lead to real peace and redemption. 25 years after that extraordinary time, Ingrid Brenner Henderson stood before the United Nations in New York. Now an American citizen with grown children, she had been invited to speak about reconciliation and personal transformation. She carried a small leather diary, the same one she had brought with her to Fort Deans. Her speech became one of the most memorable ever given at the UN about peace and forgiveness. She spoke of the day Captain Sullivan announced their freedom to return home and how it forced them to ask themselves one profound question: what does home truly mean? "We discovered," she told the audience, "that home isn't just where you come from. It's where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature, not the worst. Forgiveness isn't something that's handed to you. It's something you earn through your actions and your decision to become better than you were before." The story of the German women who chose to stay had become a symbol of America's ability to forgive and renew. It proved that even in times of deep hatred, people could choose to see humanity in one another. Anna Weber, now Dr. Anna Weber, returned to Germany in 1965 as part of a medical exchange program. She found a nation rebuilt not only in its cities and economy, but also in its moral spirit. She often said that her experience as a prisoner in America helped her understand the true meaning of transformation because she had lived it herself. The women who had returned to Germany in 1945 also made an impact. They shared stories of kindness and respect from their time in captivity, helping other Germans believe that cooperation with former enemies could build a better future. Some became leaders in organizations promoting German-American friendship. Their story helped shape how America treated future refugees and immigrants, showing that the nation's greatest strength lay not in force, but in its ability to offer second chances to those who embraced its values of dignity and hope. As Ingrid ended her speech at the UN, she held up her old diary. "In this book," she said, "I wrote the questions that every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become? The remarkable thing about America is that it gave me the freedom to choose new answers." The story of the German women who begged to stay in America reminds us that even in humanity's darkest times, people can decide to change their own endings. It shows that redemption is real when it is offered and accepted, and that the greatest victory over hatred is turning enemies into friends, prisoners into citizens, and despair into hope. Their story continues to inspire new generations of Americans and Germans, proving that the human spirit can rise above even the deepest divisions of war. They stayed not to escape their past, but because in American captivity, they had discovered something worth defending and sharing with the world.